All right, I think we're all set. Set to stream and recording.
And we're letting the attendees in, or are they?
They're popping in.
Okay. So you're gonna give me like a finger when we're ready to go?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Oh, so everyone's listening to this conversation right now.
They are, which is okay.
Fantastic. Let's just drop the curtain. All right, excellent. Well, welcome everybody. As you know, may know, I shouldn't presume. I'm Vincent D'Agostino. I'm the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs. This is our first of our University Scholars Series this spring. And I'm very excited for the conversation. Before I get to the main introduction, though, and let our speaker take the stage, we got a couple of items that we always want to walk through. So to begin with our land acknowledgement. So, well, someone skipped. There it is. While we gather at San Jose State University, we are gathered on the ethno-historical tribal territory of the Damian Ohlone, who were the direct ancestors of the lineages enrolled in the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, and who were missionized into Mission Santa Clara, San Jose, and Dolores. The lands on which San Jose State University is established was and continues to be of significance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We also recognize that the ancestors of the Muwekma Ohlone constructed and maintained the 3 Bay Area missions. Our campus extends to surrounding areas that held a tupentak, a traditional roundhouse, which was once located at the historic Lope Nino land grant Rancho Posomi y Positos de la Animas, the Little Well of Soul, and also Marcelo, Pio, and Cristobal's land grant Rancho Ulistac, which were places of celebration and religious ceremonies, as well as nearby ancestral heritage shell mounds that served as the tribe's traditional cemetery sites and territorial monuments. San Jose State University also desires to honor the military service of the Muwekma who have honorably served overseas during World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and who are still serving in the United States Armed Forces today. Before I get to the full introduction, just a couple of quick announcements. We do record these webinars. And we eventually post them so everybody can have access to them. If you have questions today, we ask that you use the Q&A function. We'll be able to manage the questions there. You can populate that throughout the talk, and at the end, Dr. Johnson will have a chance to answer those questions. So with that, I want to thank all those who helped bring this together. The Office of the Provost obviously has supported this. The King Library, the SJSU Martin Luther King Library, which plays a critical role in putting this together. The Department of English and Comparative Literature, as well as the Division of Research and Innovation, who've all sponsored this talk today. So with that, let me get to our speaker today, Dr. Allison Johnson. Allison is an outstanding colleague here, recently promoted to associate professor in 2023. She has a BA, an MA, and a PhD in English, with a BA also in history, where she studied at Riverside, and then our old sister institution to the south, UCLA. One of the earlier institutions in the state. She has an unbelievably prolific career, having authored 2 books with Louisiana State University Press, co-edited a volume, published in the Journal of Civil War, the Cambridge Companion to the Literature of the American Civil War and Reconstruction, and numerous other journals, including the American Studies Journal. She's been invited to give talks around the country. And what's also so exciting is she has a very robust scholarship of engagement where she has developed a corpus of public lectures based on her research, including speaking at Gettysburg National Military Park and Visitor Center, and been on numerous broadcasts and other things like that. I'm really excited for this talk. I've been waiting for it. So with that, let me get out of the way and let Dr. Johnson take over the mic and talk to us today about the post-war lives of amputee Civil War veterans. Dr. Johnson.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to start my slides and then share that with you First of all, thank you so much to Provost Del Casino, Mariah, and Anina, everyone who helped to set this up. Let's make sure you see everyone see my screens? Yes?
Looks good.
Yes. Excellent. Okay. First of all, are there any left-handers in the group? You can just announce yourselves if you want in the chat. If there are, you are part of only 10% of the population who is left-handed. In the 19th century, it would have been even lower, about 2%, because of stigmas associated with left-handedness. Oh wow, the provost. Okay, well, welcome to the lefties. All right. Oops, sorry. Okay, there we go. In 1864, Sergeant Freeman S. Mahan, I don't know if he's related to our mayor, maybe, of Company C, 102nd New York Infantry, wrote his name, regiment, and hometown in large, sloppy letters on the page of a reminiscence book, while recuperating at Central Park Hospital in New York City, and you can see that on the right. Underneath his entry, another person wrote, "The above was written with the left hand. Mr. Mahan lost his right arm in the Battle of Resaca, Georgia, 15th May, 1864, under General Hooker, W.O.B." W.O.B. was William Olin Bourne, a newspaper editor and dedicated hospital volunteer during the Civil War. In 1865, Bourne announced the first of 2 left-handed penmanship contests for men who lost their right arms while fighting for the Union. Bourne was clearly inspired by his interactions with men like Mahan. One of the leading purposes of the contest was to demonstrate to disabled men that they could find gainful employment that didn't depend on having 2 functional hands or arms. As such, Bourne called on veterans to submit specimens of their best left-handed business penmanship in the form of personal statements. Some contestants sent in straightforward descriptions of their time during the war, including details about enlistment, service, wounding, and discharge. Others reflected on the political and personal ramifications of their sacrifice. Others wrote poems focusing on their changed bodies, and I'll talk about a few of them in a second. Bourne hoped to publish the contest entries, proclaiming that the manuscript would be one of the best literary contributions to the history of the war, as well as the memorial of an entirely new feature in literature, the united production of several hundred left-arm veterans of the battlefield. Though the volume was never published, Bourne was right. The writings of the self-proclaimed left-arm corps provide invaluable insight into how Americans, especially those permanently marked by the conflict, responded to and interpreted the Civil War. Until recently, most scholarly accounts of literature stemming from the conflict claimed that Civil War writers willfully covered over mass suffering with uncomplicated patriotism and engaged in willful forgetting in the interest of reconciliation and reunification. However, amputated limbs cannot be reconciled, reunited, or normalized. They haunt Bourne's collection, stark reminders of the most destructive war ever fought on American soil. The left-handed writings also shed light on mid to late, oh no, what is happening? Sorry, my ad block has been updated. Thank you for letting me know, computer. Hopefully everything is back. I'd also like to thank AdBlock for sponsoring this speech. So the left-handed writings also shed light on mid to late 19th century conceptions of disability, how the Civil War influenced them, and how wounded men navigated the stigmas associated with what were considered imperfect or incomplete bodies. The contest attempted to make the fragmented bodies of amputees useful and framed the penmanship specimens as proof that left-arm men could successfully reintegrate into American society and the increasingly industrial workforce. Despite this, the contestants were also able to construct their own identities and tell their own stories. Many of the amputees mourned their sacrificed limbs, but also recognized the historical importance of their service. They preserved the Union and helped to end slavery, and they were proud of it. However, their faith in the cause was at times small comfort for personal pain or the difficulty they had putting themselves back together in a society that labeled them crippled. Bourne announced the first contest in his newspaper, The Soldier's Friend, which catered to soldiers during the war and veterans after, and newspapers nationwide followed suit. In an article published in July of 1865 titled Left-Handed Penmanship, the New York Times announced a contest intended to, quote, furnish fresh pleasure or benefit for the soldiers. Bourne now offers premiums amounting to $500 for the 4 best specimens of penmanship by left-arm soldiers of the Union. Any man who has lost his right arm in the service may compete. He may write an original or selected article upon a patriotic theme, and he must write not less than 2 nor more than 7 pages. The writer must also give his name in full, his regiment, company, and rank, the list of battles in which he was engaged, the place where he lost his arm, and his post office address, end quote. The image on the left announces these premiums. The committee in charge of reading the submissions and awarding prizes included the famous poet William Cullen Bryant, who was also the president of the Sanitary Commission, and President Theodore Roosevelt's father, who was also named Theodore. 270 men sent penmanship samples to the first contest, and 113 sent submissions to the second competition. The second contest rewarded 10 veterans with $50 premiums and autograph letters written by celebrated Union officers such as Ulysses S. Grant, David Farragut, and Philip Sheridan. Broadsides and invitations like this one in the middle here announced some bearing slogans like "Disabled but not disheartened" and "The Left Arm Corps, get in the field," announced the grand exhibition of left-handed penmanship. 2 exhibitions, one in New York City and one in Washington, D.C., displayed submissions from the first contest. Contemporary articles described how large crowds admired the so-called specimens of penmanship. Directions for the second competition encouraged contestants to send photographs and required entrants to submit signed affidavits, and you can see one here, verifying that they were actually disabled and that they had been right-handed prior to the war. Burritt Stiles of Company A, 14th Connecticut Infantry sent 2 photographs, one featuring his stump and one displaying his artificial limb. The third image is a sample of his penmanship. A quick side note on prosthetics for those who might be curious. Union veterans were entitled to free artificial limbs like the one that Stiles is using here from the government. Confederate veterans had to rely on their state governments since they had waged a treasonous war. While a few contestants referred to their prosthetics as functional, many more described discomfort or a complete inability to use a prosthesis since they didn't have enough tissue left to attach an artificial limb. While exploring pension records last summer, I found that a large percentage of veterans submitted applications for the monetary value of an artificial limb since they were unable to use one. So back to the contestants. Veterans who participated in the contest were almost exclusively volunteers. To the best of my knowledge, only 4 were drafted, and 1 was a substitute, a soldier who was paid by another to take the place of another drafted man. Most of them enlisted in the first year of the war. Some of them, 34 of them in the first month of the war, April 1861. Some fought in a long list of battles, while others were wounded in their first engagements. 24 lost their arms in and around Petersburg, 21 at Cold Harbor, and 20 at Gettysburg. 30 commissioned officers, 52 non-commissioned officers, and 185 privates participated in the first contest, while 21 commissioned and 34 non-coms competed in the second. Though around 179,000 Black men served in the Union Army, only 2 submitted to the first contest and none to the second. This was potentially due to lower literacy rates among formerly enslaved men, though many became literate during and after the war. The youngest contestant was 15 when he enlisted, and the oldest was 52. At least 53 of the contestants were foreign-born. The rules of Bourne's contest required that amputees identify the battles in which they lost their arms, and many of them went beyond simple identification to describe in graphic detail their wounds and amputations. In doing so, they revealed what lay beneath the empty sleeve, a popular wartime and post-war symbol. Before getting into the submissions and post-war lives of the specific veterans, I want to talk briefly about 3 interconnected concepts crucial to understanding the cultural significance of these left-handed writings: the empty sleeve, the amputated right arm, and the adaptive left arm. In popular literature of the time, empty sleeves spoke on behalf of silenced soldiers, calling for pity instead of requiring a direct confrontation with the lasting effects of violence. Bourne's newspaper printed an article entitled "Empty Sleeves" in 1868, and you can see a quote on the left. which acted as an interpretive guide for post-war readers. In our streets, in our offices, on our farms, everywhere we meet empty sleeves. Sleeves the wind blows against broken ribs, whips about crippled bodies. Sleeves whose emptiness tells of arms blown off in battle, of arms lost in strife for the life of a nation. Empty sleeves that speak more eloquently than tongue or type of patriotism, of courage, of faith in the right, of hope and justice. The article implies that empty sleeves tell what the amputees cannot. David Barker's popular poem and the illustration, titled The Empty Sleeve, and the illustrations it inspired, including the one that is on the right of the screen, also reveal how the titular concept covered over amputees' individual stories and voices. The poem, which first appeared in 1863, features a generic and tellingly silent one-armed man. Barker's speaker tells onlookers, quote, "Till this very hour I could ne'er believe what a telltale thing is an empty sleeve, what a weird, queer thing is an empty sleeve," end quote. The sleeve, not the veteran, tells of a battlefield of gore, of the saber's clash, of the cannon's roar, of the deadly charge, of the bugle's note, of a gurgling sound in a foeman's throat. It's a very talkative sleeve. Despite all it tells, an empty sleeve is sanitized and suitable for children, as indicated by the engraving on the previous slide and this postcard inspired by the poem and the engraving that features an actual one-armed veteran named Henry Meacham. Confronting this cultural tendency towards silencing, contestants could instead focus on right stumps and functional left hands, which are much more prevalent in the contest entries than artificial limbs and empty sleeves. Instead of letting their sleeves speak for them, the Left Arm Corps purposefully testified to both national trauma and individual experience. In the face of representational difficulties and bodily hindrances, amputees refused to become objects of pity and invested their left arms in missing or maimed right arms with significant symbolic power. In substituting the left hand for the right, the contest implied, veterans would ostensibly reestablish their masculinity, even if they couldn't engage in what contestant Phineas P. Whitehouse called, quote, manly labor, unquote. Farming, taking care of livestock, and performing other household chores. As a side note, many of the veterans had farmed prior to the war, and some continued to farm afterward, despite their wounds. Many, however, found careers that didn't require as much or any manual labor. Whitehouse, for example, taught at a school for recently freed people in Maryland shortly after the war, and was a prolific writer and journalist. Obviously, such professional and personal transitions weren't easy or immediate, and often involved anxieties about incompetence. Whitehouse, whose handwriting you can see on the right here, was a corporal for the 6th New Hampshire Volunteers and competed in both contests. He kept his right arm and his hand, but was unable to use them following a resection of the ulna bone. Just in case people aren't familiar with that term, a resection refers to removing a portion of a bone or organ. In Whitehouse's case, the surgeon removed the bullet as well as 3 inches of bone, which resulted in total disability of the lower arm and hand. His poem, My Crippled Arm, which won a $25 prize for literary merit, indicates the uneasy relationship between his remembered arm and a shattered remnant. The poem begins with a recollection of the arm's former status. Quote, "'Twas hardy once and strong for manly labor, could shoulder musket or could turn the saber, could wield the pen or till New England soil," end quote. A rebel bullet destroys his right arm and makes it a weak and feeble patient, in turn threatening his ability to perform manly duties. Shapeless and feeble, a word that comes from the Latin for something to be wept over, the arm doesn't enable forgetting. For Whitehouse, it is a constant reminder of the war. He encourages readers to confront the repercussions of disfigurement. Quote, "I look at this feeble thing before me, the piteous wreck of what was once an arm, and can you wonder if a cloud comes o'er?" Whitehouse's arm will never fully heal, and thus disrupts narratives of post-war recovery and forgetting. However, Whitehouse ends his poem on a hopeful note, and this is him pictured on the right. He is sure that his remaining arm will a final victory see. Whitehouse focuses on his true and faithful one stout arm, arguing that though his left arm is weak, for life's stern conflicts he is still defended. The remaining fight is removed from the battlefield. Whitehouse and his left arm fight to construct an alternative form of wholeness and masculinity, one that depends on not on an artificial limb, but instead on perseverance. And I should have said, though his right arm is weak, not his left arm. Like Whitehouse, Second Sergeant Thomas Perrine addresses the physical, economic, and interpersonal repercussions of losing his right arm in his Sinister Manuscripta, pictured on the left, a title that combines the Latin words for left and handwritten. However, Perrine, a veteran of Company G 140th Pennsylvania Volunteers, links racial identity and political agency, as well as masculinity, to bodily wholeness. Wounded at Chancellorsville, his first and only battle, Perrine claims that losing his right arm is tantamount to losing his identity as an enfranchised white American man. Adding insult to injury, that loss also results in romantic rejection. Through puns and tongue-in-cheek humor, Perrine's stump embodies his and other contestants' concerns that losing an arm has made them less of a man in more ways than one. Perrine first mentions racial identity in relation to his romantic troubles following amputation. Poetic license allows Perrine to lose his arm on May Day and also lose the love of Miss May Day. He returns home to her, lacking the hand he had previously promised. Though he offers her his other hand, uninjured by the fight, since it is all he has left, she tells him 'twould not be right. According to Perrine, amputation threatens to destroy masculine viability and virility. Moreover, it threatens to turn white men black. Perrine equates his body's maiming with marks of race by invoking the Supreme Court's infamous 1857 decision regarding Dred Scott's suit for freedom. Quote, "These Negroes all," Judge Taney said, "a white man's right do lack. The rebels left not right to me, I might as well be black." End quote. The loss of the right hand, Perrine implies, is equivalent to the loss of political rights. Physical wounding, it seems, can reduce a white soldier to the level of disenfranchised enslaved people. Obviously, Perrine is exaggerating. A disabled white veteran remains white and can still vote. Nevertheless, he underscores legitimate concerns about the lasting effects of amputation. His one consolation, he tells us, is that when wars again shall be and congressmen shall say 2 arms, they can't say that to him. As a one-armed man, Perrine is safe from the provost marshal with his draft, his ineligibility, both evidence of his reduced status and proof of his prior service. In order to write about their mangled or missing right arms, contestants had to adapt to using a supposedly lesser limb. Left, which comes from the Old English word for paralysis, carries the cultural connotations of weakness, effeminacy, ineffectuality, and evil. Remember that Latin, sinister, no offense to all the lefties in the audience. Though it is impossible to know if members of the left arm corps were solely right-handed prior to being wounded, extremely impressive specimens sent in by a number of contestants show that some men took to writing with their left hands with greater alacrity than others. The contest assumed that right-handedness was the norm and implicitly excluded left-handed men. In other words, in addition to issues I addressed earlier, contestants had to also deal with stigmas associated with left-handedness. In response, many of them presented a left-handed form of masculine competence and economic viability. Henry W. Palmer, whose handwriting you can see below, a 20-year-old veteran of the 31st Maine Volunteers, addresses his missing right arm but shifts focus to his other limb. "Lost right arm," Palmer exclaims, "thou wert a member of a perfect body given to country in her day of trial. And while Virginia's soil is enriched by thy decay, the remnant of that soldier body is reserved for such further duties as country may demand." End quote. After describing a macabre search for his amputated limb, strange sensations are those of him standing beside the grave of a member of his own body, he tells us, Palmer returns to what remains, his future as a left-arm man. His anthropomorphized right hand, quote, "bequeaths unto the left arm all the properties of which it died, seized, and possessed," end quote. The young veteran understands the loss of his arm in legal terms. Quote, "The seal of this last will and testament was the blood seal of amputation. Patriotism, love of country, and equal rights were the subscribing witnesses to the instrument," end quote. Palmer aligns his personal sacrifice with the survival of the Union and equates bodily loss with exemplary masculinity, encouraging his fellow quote-unquote mutilated soldiers to join him in his efforts. Alfred Whitehouse probably submitted the most impressive left-handed penmanship specimen, which you can see on the left. As far as I know, he's no relation to Phineas. White House, he also addressed and celebrated the unique community of veterans he called the right and left arm of the nation's defense. Born in England, he enlisted in 1859 and was wounded in the first battle of the war. A poem he submitted to the second contest connects his amputated right arm to the saved Union and acknowledges the work ahead for his remaining left limb. Quote, "The right arm's gone, the nation yet remains. Though many perish, yet we are saved. The right will triumph over wrong, though it leave us but one left arm strong." His penmanship is obviously more impressive than his poetic stylings. White House refuses to erase his loss, instead creating a close relationship between Northern victory and the sacrifices of the Left Arm Corps. Like Palmer, White House commemorates his lost arm, but shifts focus to his left-handed future. Speaking of the future, I'd like to now shift to what I've learned about the post-war lives of members of the Left Arm Corps by examining census, military service, and pension records, as well as newspaper articles. As the country moved towards and into the 20th century, members of the Left Arm Corps wore their service and sacrifice on their empty sleeves, living monuments, as one contestant wrote, of the conflict that ended slavery. Their status as living monuments did not fade with time. Losing their right arms remained a crucial aspect of their identities, both in the ways they define themselves and in the ways others define them. Though it is impossible to summarize or generalize the sentiments of 333 men, it is clear that many of the veterans lived as proud members of the Left Arm Corps, carrying their experiences and changed bodies into futures shaped by their time as soldiers. The short and/or troubled post-war lives of a not insignificant number of contestants also indicate the difficulties of recovery and adaptation. First, I'd like to tell you about the post-war lives of the veterans you've already met today: Phineas P. Whitehouse, Thomas Perrine, Henry Palmer, and Alfred Whitehouse. Phineas P. continued to write, using his left hand for penning poetry, as well as petitioning the federal government for an increase in pension. The medical and surgical history of the war, of the rebellion, which you can see on the left, included an illustration of a plaster cast of Whitehouse's forearm, and reported that his hand had not improved by 1873. His inability to use his continued inability to use his limb entitled him to $24 a month by 1886. Here's a pension on the right from that year, in which Whitehouse explains he is eligible for an increase. In 1898, the Boston Globe referred to him as a soldier poet, and he read an original poem during a celebration of his hometown in 1902. Married with 3 children, he was a proud member of the Grand Army of the Republic, or GAR, which was the largest Union veterans organization. He died in 1910 at the age of 68. A few things to note before getting into more specifics. The pension system was initially established during the war to support soldiers who could no longer serve due to wounds or illness. Legislation determined how much money specific types of disabilities merited. Men who had lost one arm, for example, initially received $15 a month, and the amount increased over time. Veterans had to advocate for themselves with the Pension Bureau and pension agents, applying for increases in payments when new legislation was passed, as well as submitting physician reports indicating the necessity of a higher pension amount due to increased mobility or health issues. Like Whitehouse, members of the Left Arm Corps continued to use their left-handed penmanship in order to support themselves and their families in more ways than one, through their professions and in their interactions with the Pension Bureau. After the war, Thomas Perrine attended law school. He worked as an attorney and judge, as well as a newspaper editor in Minnesota, but moved to Colorado in hopes of improving his health. Though his poem indicated the potential romantic difficulties amputee veterans might face, he married in 1878 and had 2 stepdaughters and a son with his wife Inez. Junior vice commander of his GAR post, he died in 1890 at the age of 48 as a result of his wounds. An affidavit signed by Lawrence M. Stevens in support of Perrine's widow obtaining a pension after his death reported that Perrine wasn't well enough to practice law in his final years. Perhaps overstating the case in order to secure Inez's support, since widows had to prove their husbands had died as a result of their military service, Stevens claimed, quote, "that his life was as truly sacrificed on the battlefield as though he had died there. My knowledge of him leads me confidently to conclude," end quote. In Stevens' formulation, Perrine's physical suffering and early death outweighed his accomplishments in peacetime, at least in terms of the federal government's responsibility to his dependents. Perrine's former roommate asserted that the veteran, when questioned why he was so pale, answered that it was on account of the pain in the stub of his arm, that there was very little time when he did not suffer. He only acknowledged his pain, questioned, but there was no time, either day or night, when the pain was not incessant and at times almost intolerable. Perrine's mostly silent suffering stands in stark contrast to the penmanship contest's stated goals of rehabilitation and reintegration. Even as the country healed and reconciled, betraying the freedmen in the process, Perrine and others like him continued to suffer, carrying the violence and excruciating pain of the battlefield with them. In verifying Henry W. Palmer's identity as part of his contest submission, 3 select men of his hometown, so 3 local officials, wrote, quote, "Henry comes back to us, though injured in body, yet possessing those moral excellences which he has at all times exhibited," end quote. For 11 years, though, he had to reside in the Milwaukee branch of the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers, though he later returned to Maine to help his father manage a farm. When he died in 1925 at the age of 80, the retired bookkeeper left behind insufficient funds to pay for his funeral and burial. The U.S. Veterans Bureau footed the bill. Alfred Whitehouse used his amazing penmanship skills to continue his pre-war work as a sign painter. He was elected chaplain of his local branch of the GAR in 1909 and later worked as a postal clerk, which was a popular position among amputee veterans. By the time he died at the age of 80, he had 4 children. Though every veteran was an individual with a unique story, life, and bodily configuration, for the purposes of giving you an overview, I'm going to focus on a few categories for the rest of this talk. Upstanding citizens, politicians/government officials, the notorious or infamous, and carriers of memory. And if I have time in the Q&A, I can throw in a few fun but random finds. When members of the Left Arm Corps passed away, their obituaries regularly mentioned their service, their missing or disabled arms, their membership in the Grand Army of the Republic, their contributions to their communities, and sometimes their participation in Bourne's penmanship contest. Their exemplary citizenship during and after the conflict made them particularly worthy of praise. Barnabas Barney Palmer, pictured on the left, formerly First Sergeant of Company C, 9th Canvas Cavalry, continued his military service on the frontier after the war, but then returned to civilian life due to his health and supported himself with clerical work. He was elected district court clerk in Douglas County in 1866 and was reelected 7 times. Unfortunately, he was only in his late 30s when he died after months of delicate health. An obituary in a Lawrence newspaper reported that his disease, quote, assumed the form of quick consumption, end quote, and was exacerbated by his wounds. A memorial resolution passed by the county bar sang his praises and noted his sacrifice. Quote, "As a soldier for the preservation of our nationality, he lost his right arm and bore most honorable scars, a constant reminder to us of his patriotism, of his bravery and zeal." Veterans who did survive into old age continued to narrate their service and sacrifice, emphasizing their honorable scars while petitioning for higher pensions. Conrad Dipple, whose handwriting you can see on the right, wrote to the pension commissioner in 1903 to request an increase in pension as he needed constant attendance in his ailments and injuries and could not live many years longer, as he said. Almost 40 years after the penmanship contest, he labeled his petition, "Specimen of my left-handed writing," as you could see in the image, indicating his adaptation even as he bemoaned his physical state. Despite his dire predictions in 1903, in 1910, a local newspaper reported on his 80th birthday celebration, noting that he was in, quote, vigorous health and in the enjoyment of his faculties, end quote. The article also noted he had many interesting incidents to relate of his experiences during that time which tried men's souls. Like Barney Palmer, Dipple put his handwriting to good use as a government official, serving as a notary public. Since his pension file doesn't have any documentation past 1903, I'm unable to determine if his health suddenly improved or if he or the newspaper writer exaggerated the situation. What I can say is that he used his left-handed penmanship to advocate for his family, himself and his family, reminding pension officials of the link between his diminished physical state and suffering to the successful capture of 450 Johnny Rebs, 4 guns, 4 flags, etc. during the Battle of Petersburg. When Dipple died at the age of 82, his obituary appeared on the front page of the Watertown, Wisconsin News. Oops. There we go. Like Dipple, Wallace Mordecai Moore continued to suffer from constant pain and sensitivity in his stump. Nevertheless, he moved to Iowa after the war, built a sod house, and was elected auditor amid cheers for one-armed Moore. In 1930, he used his left hand to contact the Pension Bureau about an expected increase in pension, as you can see on the left. He had spoken to fellow veterans, he explained, and they had received $100 instead of $90. In response, the acting commissioner of the Bureau informed him that the only men who were completely disabled and or blind and required constant assistance qualified for the increase. 65 years after the end of the Civil War, Moore was still part of a community of disabled veterans and continued to advocate for himself. He lived to be 90 and died in 1932. Here is a photograph of Wallace with his daughter and grandchild, courtesy of his great-grandson, Alan Ford. One-Armed Moore's campaign slogan should come as no surprise. The political careers of a number of contestants demonstrate the political cachet of an empty sleeve or a mangled arm. When Martin Van Buren Keller ran for clerk of the Orphans Court in Pennsylvania, the Lancaster Intelligencer announced he would, quote, be the crippled soldier candidate, end quote, indicating a larger trend of similarly maimed men who purposefully or not benefited from the political capital of being physically marked by their military service. Anthony Beaver was appointed postmaster in 1869 and successfully ran as a Republican for associate judge, serving 2 terms. 1 year after he died, his son ran for county sheriff and continued to trade on the veteran sacrifice. An article announcing the son's candidacy noted that his father had been, quote, a brave soldier of the War of the Rebellion who, in one of the battles, lost an arm, end quote. Multiple contestants served as state legislatures, while Roswell P. Bishop represented Michigan's 9th District in the House of Representatives. At least 10 veterans were city or county treasurers, but quite a few had trouble staying on the right side of the law. Sidney M. Hosier avoided punishment for allegedly misappropriating funds due to a statute of limitations, while Herman Baumhager served 6 months in prison for embezzling. Charles A. Edmonds ran successfully for state commissioner of lands, but was tried by the Michigan Senate in 1872 for impeachment due to corrupt conduct in office, crimes and misdemeanors, including embezzling, drunkenness, adulterous activities, specifically frequenting brothels, and publishing an obscene newspaper about a political appointment. Honestly, it kind of sounds like he'd be fun. The trial lasted 6 weeks and cost the state over $19,000. A reporter described Edmonds' appearance in court, noting that, quote, the stump of his right arm suggests patriotic service and stirs a feeling of sympathy for the soldier, but his face is not so frank and open as one would choose to behold in looking upon a great and noble specimen of a man. Though Edmonds was acquitted, his tenure as commissioner remained infamous and set the precedent for impeaching state officials in Michigan. Speaking of infamy, the contestant who most undermined the optimistic rhetoric of the contest, namely that the left hand could successfully replace the right so that one-armed men could seamlessly enter civilian society and the workforce, was William S. Bergen. The youngest contestant, Bergen was wounded when he was 15 years old. Using his left-handed penmanship, he secured employment as a clerk in the War Department. However, he lost the position after the, quote, gay life of the national capital proved too much for the young clerk, end quote. He returned home to Ohio, became a hard drinker and rough citizen, and lived an itinerant lifestyle. He shot and killed a hotel employee named T.J. McBride while, quote, on a heavy debauch, end quote. His defense cited familial insanity and his drinking, but put most of the blame on his amputation. Quote, when a boy, he was gentle and tractable, but losing his arm in the army, his nature became changed, end quote. He was executed on December 7th, 1877 in a horribly botched hanging. One of the numerous articles is on the left. Bergen and his family fervently hoped for a commutation, but the governor refused. One report explained, quote, the prevailing opinion is bitterly against the murderer. It is extremely rare to hear sympathy expressed for him, end quote. Significantly, the same article failed to mention the loss of his right arm. In the end, his service and sacrifice, as well as the missing right arm that symbolized both, were insufficient to overcome a murder conviction. Other veterans engaged in less criminality, but still managed to buck the trend of upright citizenship and heroic survival that ostensibly defined the post-war lives of most members of the Left Arm Corps. Josiah Phillips served time in Sing Sing for knifing a man who attempted to steal his pension payment and was later killed after a drunken argument with his wife over yet another pension payment. In stark contrast to the glowing obituaries for most of the contestants, this article on the right declared he was dissipated and a well-known character about Newburgh. He was drunken, foul-mouthed, and generally worthless, and had a jail record and had been a source of much annoyance to the police. Articles about him mentioned his missing arm, but focused primarily on his skullduggery. Bergen and Phillips are extreme cases, but their stories help to provide a fuller picture of the post-war lives of Civil War veterans, especially those visibly marked by their service. For better or worse, amputation or severe wounds influence those post-war lives, and some members of the LAC, Left Arm Corps, dedicated themselves to carrying the memory of the conflict that shaped them. John Bryson, superintendent for multiple national cemeteries, a position often filled by wounded veterans, sent multiple letters to the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle praising his regiment in eloquent prose. Harrison O. Thomas was the first member of his local GAR post, serving as post historian and publishing a book of autobiographical sketches of local veterans. When he died in 1916 at the age of 76, the Boston Globe reported that he was one of the best known citizens of the city. A front page article published 1 year before Ulysses S. Eaton's death, you can see it on the left, began with a description of the then 88-year-old. U.S. Eaton, slowly plodding about the streets of Cambridge City with an empty sleeve dangling at his right side and a cane lending support to his somewhat hesitating step, is one of the city's most familiar figures. The profile reported that his lack of a right arm did not prevent him from splitting wood or punishing two men who called him one-armed lass. Robert A. Pinn, on the right, received the Medal of Honor for taking command of his company after all the officers had been killed or wounded and gallantly leading it in battle. An Akron newspaper noted that he was, quote, a respected colored citizen and attorney who loved to tell of his thrilling experiences during the war. For the rest of their lives, the men I have discussed today carried the memory of the Civil War, their mangled or missing right arms, tangible proof of their service. For R. Watson Sieg, a former first lieutenant in the Michigan Volunteer Infantry who lost all use of his right arm at Gettysburg when he was shot through the lung, the penmanship contest served as forums for self-expression. Sieg, who also suffered from a gunshot wound to the head, one to the left breast, and a bayonet wound to the left leg, as you can see in the diagram included in his pension file, wrote, I hope my manuscript may recommend itself for the first credit of the well-known gentleman who composed your committee. But if it proves second to others, I shall at least be encouraged to renew diligence and perseverance in my left-hand labors. These labors do important cultural and literary work. Sieg and other members of the Left Arm Corps offer personal accounts of amputation and adaptation by proposing new ways of conceptualizing heroic masculinity and bodily disfigurement. They testify to survival and loss, successful adaptation, and painful readjustment. Thank you for letting me share some of their stories with you today.
Thank you so much, Allison. Really appreciate that. I'm excited. There is a number of questions in the Q&A. If you want to jump in on those.
Sure. So Jim Walsh asked, among the foreign-born vets who participated, from what country did the largest number come? The most represented was England and Ireland, and there were and quite a few Germans. I don't know the exact breakdown. It's probably included in my introduction to my book about the Left Arm Corps. But yeah, those were the main representations. Let's see, and some even the German soldiers sent in German writing, so I had to get somebody to help me translate it. Do I do a thumbs up to say that I've answered it? Oh, no.
Don't worry about that. We'll take care of that in the
thank
background. You can kind of just go through, so we're good.
Okay, Susie asks, what types of pain medications were offered to Civil War amputees? Whiskey, opium. They didn't have great options, especially not when they were being amputated, though some veterans did describe experiencing ether when they were undergoing amputation. One guy wrote a poem about like rising up from the surgeon's table on these wings. So, but yeah, the pain, I think that in the years following the war, there would have been a lot of alcohol use probably, and as Adam Hall says in the chat, opium addiction. Though in going through the pension files, I have not seen any, I haven't gone through all of them, but I haven't seen any references yet to opium addiction. But yes, it was very common. I think there was recently a book published about that. William asked how I located and found these documents. It was kind of by chance that I was in the Library of Congress at looking at for other things written by Civil War soldiers, and one of the librarians there recommended I look at this box of papers, and I couldn't believe what I had come across. I'm not the first person who discovered them. Other people, as I found, had looked at them, but I really knew that I had found something special and that I really wanted to share these men's stories, because, like I said, their writings had never been published. So yeah, it's in a box. You cannot access it anymore, but you can look at it online. The whole collection has been digitized and transcribed. So if you go to the Library of Congress website, you can do that. You can look at them. Was their mental health addressed by any 19th century medical doctors? I mean, let's see. I'm not an expert on that. I do know that unfortunately, at least 2 of the veterans committed suicide. And I think in the newspaper articles, sometimes it was blamed on alcoholism or on, so yeah, I mean, just think about how well we treat mental health today. We still don't do a great job. So yeah, it wasn't particularly great treatment in the 19th century. I think there would have also been pressure on the veterans to suffer in silence and not to talk about, having those kinds of upsetting, or talk about those upsetting things. But that's a very good question. And I think there has been some, I think there's a book called A Heavy Burden that's about mental health among Civil War veterans. Megan, we were interested in your explanation of empty sleeve, wounded soldiers. If I have theories about why there haven't been similar popular discourses about the disabled bodies of U.S. American veterans of 21st century. Why did 19th century popular culture focus on veterans' bodies while 21st century pop culture is more interested in their invisibly marked mental health? That's a really excellent question, because there are a lot of amputees from the Iraq wars, from Afghanistan, and obviously they have much better prosthetics now, which could be part of it. But I mean, there were amputees in World War I, World War II, men who had faces that needed to be restructured. So I'm not sure why they focused. I think maybe we focus more on mental health because we have come to realize how significant things like PTSD are. And obviously we're better equipped to understand mental health. I am interested in looking at kind of representations of military amputee veterans in the contemporary moment. I'm definitely not an expert on it, but I would say that because we are more focused on mental health, and obviously have large numbers of soldiers and veterans who are dealing with things like PTSD, I think we've been forced to to focus on those invisible, and we've also just become more aware of like invisible disabilities, right? Like those things that we cannot see. Obviously the missing sleeve, missing arm was very evident. It's easier to see. So an anonymous attendee, did wounded men keep contact with another over the years? Some of them did, yes. I have found newspaper articles about 2 of them having reunions. That was a huge thing for Union veterans to have reunions in the years following, and eventually they started reuniting with Confederate veterans as well. It's all part of the sort of like reconciliation of white people at the expense of Black people. But yes, they did some of them kept in contact. They did, like I said, maintain their sort of belonging in this unique group. One guy even found the nurse that had treated him. There were lots of newspaper articles, so that's not quite what you were asking, but I thought it was interesting that 60 years later he reunited with a nurse who had treated him. And you're also interesting, like some of them falling from grace. Like, yeah, did they have a support group type of environment? I mean, there were those homes for disabled soldiers that I mentioned, that quite a few of them lived and would return to. But in terms of support groups, but yeah, I think that's a good. There is one contestant writes about how there's another one-armed man in town and another one-legged man in town, and they kind of seem to know each other. The person who killed the hotel front desk worker was named William S. Bergen. Bergin, and he was the first person to be executed in Knox County, Ohio. And it was this huge, they were, I don't want to tell you I mean, if you're interested, you can always email me and I can send you the descriptions of why it was so botched, but it was not, his story is definitely sad. But I thought it was very interesting how the newspapers sort of explained, or the defense tried to explain that it was his arm that caused him to really lose it. Did the greater number of visible amputees after the Civil War contribute to more general advocacy for people with disabilities, or was any such advocacy more specific to veterans? That's an excellent question, and I definitely recommend reading Sarah Hanley Cousins' Bodies in Blue, which is about disability during the Civil War. But yeah, I mean, there was definitely a difference in how these veterans were presented and how they presented themselves with how so-called freaks would have been presented, like people who were born without limbs, for example. These veterans, they had lost their arms in serving their country, and so it had this built-in prestige to it, as opposed to somebody who was, incomplete from birth, or who had lost some ability in an accident or something. So there's definitely some difference, but it did lead to more. I think, visibility for it definitely, I mean, Congress had to deal with all the disability laws. This kind of goes to Fusan Wang's question. They had to pass legislation, like down to did you lose a finger? Okay, here's how much money you get. Did you lose a foot? Okay, then here's how much money you get. Was it a left foot or a right foot? So those kinds of laws were passed. I am not familiar with the ugly laws. That seems like something I should be familiar with. So I will look into that. But I think that, unfortunately, because they were specially disabled, like they had the aura, they had lost something in service to their country, that there was more understanding, and even as they were dealing with the sort of silencing things I talked about, and the sort of, we should pity them, all of that, it was still an elevated form of disability to a certain extent.
Can I ask a quick question? I hate to jump the queue, but I'm going to. So you talk about masculinity and the reconstruction and reorganization of masculinity here. And I find that very interesting, having kind of worked in that space. And so what does that masculinity end up kind of looking like, for this community? I think that's a really interesting question as you articulated it.
It looks like being able to support your family, being able to be gainfully employed. So many of them became clerks or bookkeeper, all of these positions that don't quite exist anymore because, we have computers. But stenographers, so people who are writing down, who are taking notes during court cases, and then they'd become clerks. Prior to the progressive era, you got government jobs through, hey, I know this guy, I'm going to hook him up with a job. So there were people kind of looking out for them and making sure that they got some employment. But I think it was primarily that. It was continuing to be employed, and most of them have children and are married, despite, any concerns about that they were not going to be as appealing romantically to people. So I think those are the primary. But it's a masculinity that, like I said, is not dependent on complete bodies, but instead on doing your best with the body that you have, I guess. And speaking of, bodies, Jennifer asked about prosthetic options. They weren't great. Most of the men talk about how they pinch. Like I said, if you lost your arm at the shoulder, there's nothing to attach. There's really nothing to attach a prosthetic to. There were some called the Lincoln arms. There were different brands, and they would contract with the government. So if you were an amputee veteran, you would show up at a hospital and you would be fitted with a prosthetic. But so there are a few options, but they weren't anything like what we have today. They were uncomfortable, they were heavy. And my suspicion that, I think, going through all of the pension records, which I could not go through prior to publishing my collection of these writings because of the pandemic. Pretty sure that once I finish going through, most of them will have asked for the monetary equivalent of the prosthetic arm because they did not want to use the prosthetic. Though you can, and I don't know, I mean, Burritt Stiles, who knows if he could play the violin? He's with that prosthetic.
So why don't we do one more question because we're running out of time, and for people to know that we'll send you the rest of the questions and people can follow up with you, but maybe one more to wrap things up. And deeply appreciate this fantastic presentation, and clearly it's generating a lot of engagement, so it's exciting.
Yeah, I'm so happy that people have questions. Sorry that I can't answer them all. But yes, this was all during the this was during the Civil War and in the moments afterward. Let's see, Thomas, you asked about sort of, will these change the future narratives of Reconstruction? I think in some ways, I mean, I argue that in my writing about them, in that they continue to, even like I said, as you know, the blue and the gray, the Confederates and the Union veterans are meeting together, and the sort of compromise is happening at a national level and betraying many of the things that the Civil War achieved. These men are still carrying that memory, and so even in, you know, still talking about recognizing the importance of what they did, and also talking a lot about, you know, the rights of the formerly enslaved people, the rights of Black people in the years following the Civil War. So I think they have some crucial things to say about how soldiers conceptualize the results of the war that they had just fought in. But as I said, I'm still going through the pension records, so that will help me. More fully answer that question. Miguel, I don't know if you're talking Sarah Hanley Cousins. It's Hanley-Cousins, Bodies in Blue. And then my book about if you want to read more of these stories, I got to do a plug for my book. It's called The Left Arm Corps, Writings by Amputee Civil War Veterans. And I'm hoping to do a second volume. That's what I'm working on now.
Well, as a left-handed person, I want to deeply appreciate you seeing me today. So,
yeah.
and
yes.
Thank you for a great talk. It was really exciting, and lots of great questions, and a fantastic representation of the amazing work done here and done by you, Dr. Johnson. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.